That leads to a strategic paralysis on the front line.
Putin said absolutely nothing. So the guy had no feedback at all.
There's been some slightly haunting image of these little drones chasing individual soldiers as they try and get away and then exploding.
Where the hell does a submarine store? It's just a long tube.
Exactly.
It goes that way, not that way.
Not that way.
Good afternoon, Sean.
Afternoon, Bern.
Normally we say it's been a busy week, but this time, particularly as far as the war in Ukraine goes, not much needs to be happening.
Yeah, it's interesting. Normally we're reporting on events that have actually happened. This time we're looking at
what's not happened.
What's not happened.
Is it to the day? I mean, you'll know, roughly 3 weeks into Zelensky's incursion, not invasion, into part of Russia. 3 bridges have been blown up. So far, Putin appears to have done absolutely nothing. So you had some views on this last time, but what have we learnt since, and what do we think his options are now going forward?
It's been interesting listening to lots of other commentators around this, because this must have been humiliating for Putin. He must be very angry. Like most of the video footage we've seen, he can't hide his frustration and anger at this. And that's understandable. You know, he's in charge, let's be clear, the first time since 1941 that Russia's been invaded. And whilst he can paint that in as many positive colours as he likes, 150,000, maybe 200,000 people, Russians, have had to be evacuated. They will be talking. So we were sort of expecting a very swift response, and it hasn't happened. Interesting, one of the commentators talked about the fact that in the West, in the military I was part of, we delegate responsibility down to the lowest levels. So our junior non-commissioned officers, like the corporals, and the seniors, the sergeants, they're not just wearing a badge of rank. They're expected to take charge if surprises happen. They understand the intent of the commander. They understand what they're there to do. How they do it, there's a lot more latitude, because eventually, inevitably, the enemy has a vote, and therefore sometimes things don't play out the way that you expect them to. But the one thing you want to do is maintain momentum. So you need your people to be able to react and keep driving. The Russians don't have that system at all. They're paranoid about anybody doing things that is their own interpretation. So the default setting for the Russian military is to look up to your boss and ask for permission what to do next. When a big surprise like this happens, his boss turns to his boss, and his boss turns to his boss. And it goes all the way up the chain. And of course, that leads to a strategic paralysis on the front line, because until you can get hold of your boss's boss's boss, and ultimately that stops at President Putin, who might well be on his travels, he may well not be easily contactable. And who's going to break the bad news to him?
Yeah. Well, the other thing that happens when you've got that sort of stultifying chain of command is the first thing the boss does, it asks the junior person for more information. And it's, well, you think we should do this. Why do you think we should do that? Well, you know, we did it last time. That's not good enough. I need more information. And then the information forest gets denser and denser and denser until it gets to the top. And if you're not careful, it's either too dense for somebody to pick out the really incisive issues, or, as you've said before, it gets so confused you actually get the wrong information going up.
Yeah, I mean, the old rhyme, wasn't it? Send reinforcements, we're going to advance. It gets interpreted as send 3 and 4pence, we're going to a dance. Yeah. I'm not trying to make folly of this, but the more people that are involved in that communication chain, the more the core message gets lost. And as you say, you get swamped in data rather than actually quality information. And the danger is that therefore makes a decision even more difficult to make. And I guess that's why the further up you go, the more people defer to President Putin. But there's some fantastic images doing the rounds on social media that Russia's released video of some of the senior commanders briefing President Putin.
Well, yeah.
And you can actually just see the tension in the room, can't you? I mean,
well, it's like a machine that's just never going to work. And the one I watched, and I'm not sure which of the service chiefs it was, but it would have been a chief, basically came in, the room was dead quiet. It felt like going into a school headmaster's office. it was a very nervous delivery. And I seem to recall, and it finished very quickly, Putin said absolutely nothing. So the guy had no feedback at all, no further questions. The guy was just sort of dismissed. You can't run a business like that. You definitely can't run a war.
No, and the danger is you can just imagine being the guy who's briefing President Putin. Is he going to fall out of a hotel window sometime in the next week and meet some untimely end? Nobody wants to take bad news to the boss at times like this. And of course, but going back to your original question, that effectively creates time. And it's 3 weeks now. Nothing really seems to have happened. I mean, bluntly, from a military perspective, there's two clear courses of action for President Putin. He either ruthlessly deals with that incursion. It is so much easier to do a counterattack immediately after the initial attack has happened, which is why on the front line you often see one side take some ground but instantly lose it again, because they take some ground, they're exhausted, but they haven't got anywhere to dig in, and therefore they are vulnerable to being pushed back again. So the best way of pushing out forces is to do it quickly and dynamically. 3 weeks in, Ukraine has had plenty of time to consolidate its position. And also blowing the bridges. At the time, we thought that was more to protect their flanks. There's been rumours that up to 3,000 Russian soldiers have been caught in that pocket as well.
On the wrong side.
On the wrong side of it, which is why the Russians are desperately trying to put pontoon bridges. But going back to those two potential course of action for Putin, one of which is to crush it quickly, hasn't done it quickly, but he could still crush it. Ukraine will not want to lose all the soldiers that are in there, and they've already said they're not intending holding ground. But we've not seen yet Russia decide where it's taking those forces from to do that. And the alternative is that Russia largely ignores it, puts a ring of steel around where the Ukrainians are, but carries on with the main effort in the Donbass. Now that seems, from a military perspective, as a military commander, I would be focused on main effort. And Russia's main effort, I'm pretty confident, is securing the Donbass in the 10 to 12 weeks they've got before the fighting weather gives way to boggy and cold and frozen. And that seems to be what he's doing at the moment.
So we're going to stick with your conclusion from last week, which was that, quite frankly, now that land has been taken, there's really nothing more Putin can do. It looks like they're not going to go any further for now. He's got bigger fish to fry. He's going to bide his time.
And the risk here is that, which is not a military risk. So I gave you the military answer. I would imagine that what President Zelensky is gambling on is the political pressures, because Putin relies on the support of the oligarchs to stay in power. He's nervous about doing another round of mobilization because he knows that the Russian people, that won't play well. He's already lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers, either dead or really badly wounded, and that inevitably spreads around the communities. So you don't want to mobilize anymore. If Russian people hear that Russia's been invaded, Mr. Security hasn't managed to secure our borders, then that could be another chink in the armor of President Putin. So undoubtedly, although from a military perspective, focus on main effort, from a political perspective, there are risks here for President Putin leaving that enclave as it exists. Because I've also, talking to Ukrainian colleagues as well, they're all for keep pushing. And indeed, there were many questions I do a bit of blogging work as well. And a lot of questions came in about, why doesn't Ukraine push further? And you said, politically, that could be very helpful, but militarily, it leaves you very exposed. So I do think we're in an interesting cusp here that, for me, it's relatively clear what the military benefits are of pushing ahead in the Donbass. There is more to play at this than purely the military angle.
Zelensky has an ambition to build 1 million drones. We've discussed this before, and it's pretty obvious why. They're such a, low-cost, high-impact weapon that's evolved actually very quickly. He's about to announce, I think, another drone of some description. there's very little information so far that we can glean. What do you think is actually happening?
Yeah, there's been an interesting announcement. It's Ukraine's National Day celebration, their independence, 33 years of independence from the former Soviet Union. But in that speech, he alluded to the fact that Ukraine has a new weapon, a new drone. Gave a name, but nobody's heard anything about it. I can't find out anything about it at all. But in context, it's fascinating. Exactly as you say, 1 million drones a year is what Zelensky said he wants to do. Over the last few weeks, we've seen a steady increase in the number of effective targeting of Russian facilities, whether it's logistics, whether it's transport hubs, whether it's oil facilities. We saw a picture of Rostov, which is the region where one of the oil facilities was hit well over a week ago, and apparently it was still blazing. So all of a sudden you went, how are they becoming more effective? President Putin's alluded to the fact that's because they've got this new drone. When I was looking into...
Well, I mean, he's suggesting it's already in use.
Yeah, already being used.
Okay.
Now, what's been interesting, you talked about they've been used a lot on the battlefields. They have. I mean, when it's been little drones, there's been some slightly haunting image of these little drones chasing individual soldiers as they try and get away and then exploding. There's also the drones, the longer range drones that are attacking hundreds of miles potentially behind enemy lines.
And they don't need to come back.
No,
they're the job and they're
known
finished.
colloquially as suicide drones. And the suggestion seems to be, from what I can gather, this is probably Ukraine's new drone is a jet-powered drone, so probably a longer range weapon, and probably therefore focused on delivering effects much deeper into Russia. Apart from that, we can't find out much more. But what I think is fascinating about this is that I'm a product of the Western military system. When we develop a new capability, if we wanted to develop a new drone, long-range drone, it would be pretty simple to bolt the technology together to make a drone that does what you want. But you're going to fly that in peacetime, and therefore the flight testing, the safety cases, that takes a huge amount of time, and therefore it takes a long time to get something from concept into battle ready. President Zelensky doesn't have to go through those same hoops.
No.
He can bolt stuff together, and the first flight
Here's the first flight.
is going to be on a live mission.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't it be? If it works, your enemy wasn't expecting it, and if it doesn't work and it crashes, oh well, we're at war.
So I think that leads me to two sets of questions. The first is, what can we learn from that, if anything? The second is, what is the balance of considerations when you're deciding to go with something quickly with less testing? I was involved with safety case software with the MOD for quite a while, and it's a pretty heavy sort of process you go through. When I worked in the tech industry in the US, I had some contact with Apple, and they had the 10 points to make a great product. Point number 10 was be happy, be crappy. And be happy, be crappy meant as soon as there's an inkling that this might work, you launch it. You launch it knowing it's going to have lots of bugs in it, but actually better to get out quickly, earn some revenue, beat the competition, fix the bugs in real time with real customers, and suffer the complaints that come, because you'll quickly get over it if you've got a very high response iterative process. And, you know, you can argue that both ways. Seems like Zelensky has chosen the be happy, be crappy. Of course, things go wrong and then people can die. You know, that wouldn't be allowed in England, would it? So on that balance, as a military guy, if you had freedom to decide, what would be the thoughts in your head bringing you down one side or the other?
Yeah, I mean, as one of the regular criticisms of military guys is they tend to be a bit heartless, because actually you're just focused on winning. It doesn't matter, as long as it's within the law on conflict. It's not about playing the game; it's about winning, and therefore you need to bring in decisive military capability as fast as is humanly possible. And if it crashes a few times, it doesn't matter. But I do take your point. I think it's a fascinating conversation here because you're talking about software. If there aren't lives at stake, it's more just reputation. It doesn't matter. But as we were talking, it struck me there's 2 astronauts that went up to the space station for 8 days. They're going to spend 8 months up there. They could come back. But there isn't 100% confidence that the way of bringing them back, which was the planned way of bringing them back, is going to be safe. So they're going to bring that vehicle back with dummy people in, ballast, because if it goes wrong, they haven't compromised. And they're going to throw a lot of money, finding an alternative to bring them down. That's almost certainly the right answer. I'm not questioning that. But in wartime, if I delay bringing in a decisive bit of military capability, the danger is how many more people would die on the battlefields waiting for that to come in.
Right, it's the other side of the safety consideration.
Yeah, and there was lots of stories, a good illustration of this, and I hope this doesn't play wrong for our audience, but in the battles of the First World War, trench warfare, where if you stepped out of your trench, you were mown down. So that's why they stayed static for so long. If you did a artillery barrage on your enemy trenches, they largely had to hunker down, and therefore you could leap out of your trenches and charge towards them. The problem was that you had to stop the barrage in enough time not to kill any of your own people. But by doing that, you gave the enemy enough time to get out of there and they'd start firing back. The way to get round it was not to stop your barrage until your forces had virtually got to the trenches, and you would occasionally hurt or kill some of your own forces.
But you'd save a hell of a lot more. Who would be the colonel making that call?
And that's why it's incredibly difficult, decisions like that in the military. But the focus should be on winning. The focus is on operational effectiveness. And I think that's where President Zelensky has a bit of an advantage here, because bolting together technology, he's got some very smart people who have got lots of ideas. They've got access to, it's almost like they've got lots of boxes of bits of kit. Can we bolt these together? Could we make this work? Let's have a go. You couldn't do that in this country because you wouldn't be allowed to fly it.
No.
But almost
it'd be a year to get through the...
No, exactly. And the safety cases you used to work on would stop you doing that.
Yeah.
Going back to your first question, what do we learn from that, though? I'm convinced that the Ukraine war has demonstrated that if you want technology to be your asymmetric advantage, in other words, if you don't want to get locked into trench warfare, then you've got to be very agile. And it's not just a question of having good stuff on day one. You've got to have a process that allows you to be iteratively developing that, pulling new stuff in, and very quickly.
We used to say a lot in the days when I was pretty much full-time working in technology for the military, was that the command structure and the decision making in the field when things were happening was very good, very fast. The structure back home, whatever it was highly bureaucratic and would take a long time. I would guess, one might think of good reasons why that was the case. I mean, for example, in activity, when there's action, we have a thing called a UOR, urgent operational requirement. That means things can get done very quickly. Corners are cut, obviously. Bits of sticky tape are used to hold it together. Without that, then obviously the bureaucracy takes over. So surely there must be something we can do to cut into that.
No, I completely agree. And one of the challenges, which you know as well as I do, working in the industry side of this, is there's some tremendous capability and innovation in industry. The challenge is some of it won't work. I mean, bluntly, you get young kids running small companies that say they can do anything. They're bluffing. When it comes to the plunge, they can't actually do it. Now, our procurement process, because it's public money, is designed to stop that sort of person getting far enough in so that you are investing significant sums of money. Whereas come wartime, remember the Barnes-Wallis story, I've got this strange bloke outside. He's talking about bouncing a bomb on the surface of the water. Send him away. No. Bring him in. Let's listen to him. Is there something in this? Something completely madcap. We've got to have that. It's part of the DNA of our military effectiveness.
So we give Zelensky a tick.
I think it's more than a tick. I think this is for the underdog, and I mean that in the sense of Russia is a much bigger power, more resources, more money and everything. President Zelensky's got to find ways like this to tip the scales in his favour. And I love it. I love the fact that we don't know anything about it. That means Russia probably doesn't know anything about it. And if Russia doesn't know anything about it, they don't know how to combat it.
It's a good one to watch then, isn't it, really?
I think so, yeah.
And we know drones are going to be, very, very important part of conflict going forward. And we're just at the beginning of a revolution.
And for me, it's not just about drones. If drones are a vehicle for mounting a lot of innovative technology, what else is out there? One I saw an article about the other day was guided bullets. Guided bullets.
AI driven.
So this is now either AI driven or laser driven. So I drop a laser spot on your forehead from a mile away, and a bullet that I'd have to be very lucky with the time of flight, the wind, gravity drop and everything. But if I've got a laser spot and it's a guided bullet, it's going to hit you square in the head. The profound effect of technology on the way that battles are fought in the future, I think we're just scratching the surface of it.
So in talking about the collaboration of artificial intelligence and warfare, we know there's a lot of work going on. So some of the things we've been describing will be driven by AI, and it will do a much better job often than the human will do. Take a look at this. This is Elon Musk's new artificial intelligence program. This is just the computing power that's being used right now to create the learning environment so that when the AI is out doing live work, it's got the backup of the entire knowledge of the world and how you might interpret it behind it. So it looks quite frightening to me. So what do you think? What impact do you think it's going to have?
I'm not sure that we understand what the full impact is going to be just yet. I mean, if you go forward, I'm a big fan of Arnold Schwarzenegger and the Terminator wars, where actually all the war is fought vicariously by your artificial intelligence and theirs. And that is a world where artificial intelligence takes over. Now, is that where we're going to go with all this? I'm not sure. What I'm a little bit concerned about at the moment is that you can get artificial intelligence drive a car and avoid everything, but then you face it a conundrum. You're going to have an accident. Do you take out the old man or the woman with the baby? And those very individual decisions, I know as a commander, we haven't got time, but maybe we'll do it another time. The number of decisions you make that are not rational, but that are based on a judgment, that you take a risk, but you do it based on the tone of somebody's voice, your own experience, and you make a very difficult judgment that's outside the rules, but is a difficult call, and you stand by that call. I find it very difficult to see how artificial intelligence is yet remotely close to be able to make those sorts of things. And we, in war, which is all about human lives and the risk of your people and making the other people die rather than yours, I'm just not sure at the moment. I think it will have profound effects across the world, but will it take over our lives? I'm not sure.
Well, I am both with you and I have another opinion. I'm with you because I am also fearful for a number of reasons. And one is that it'll be the global corporate billion-dollar corporations that control it, and it'll be the oligarchs who can afford it. It will far exceed our own individual ability to hold knowledge, compound that knowledge and make decisions. On the road, less people will die. But the ones that do die will die in a way that we would rather maybe not have wanted if you apply the sort of emotional decision making that you described. But the thing is, the genie, Sean, is out of the bottle, and it is going to happen. So, sure, I've been a follower of Robert Kennedy Jr., you know that. I mean, I'm not particularly on his side or against him, but I just find it's a fascinating interruption in what might otherwise be a fairly predictable process of arriving at November the 5th in the US elections. He has made some uncomfortable comments in the past about Ukraine. In his speech, when he announced his long speech, we covered a lot. We announced his change of strategy and moving, in part anyway, to the Trump camp. He made a number of fairly high impact accusations about the genesis of the war in Ukraine, which we've touched on before, but now he cites actual conversations and he paints a picture that says there was another thing going on. Just listen to a few seconds of what Kennedy had to say.
President Biden sent Boris Johnson to Ukraine to force President Zelensky to tear up a peace agreement that he and the Russians had already signed, and the Russians were withdrawing troops from Kiev and Donbass and Lugansk. And that peace agreement would have brought peace to the region and would have allowed Donbass and Lugansk to remain part of Ukraine. President Biden stated that month that his objective in the war was regime change in Russia. His Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin simultaneously explained that America's purpose in the war was to exhaust the Russian army, to degrade its capacity to fight anywhere else in the world. These objectives, of course, have nothing to do with what they were telling Americans about protecting Ukraine's sovereignty. In April of 2022.
Okay, so in a nutshell, what he's saying is there's an alternative set of motives going on here, which had nothing to do with saving Ukraine, but had to do with depleting Putin's military capability, and secondly, regime change in Russia. And they took the opportunity that would otherwise ended up with a peaceful settlement, for right or wrong, ended up with a peaceful settlement. They interrupted that process to take advantage of basically fueling and equipping a war.
It is fascinating. I mean, you and I have talked a little bit about this in the margins up till now. And I do think when you're dealing with these sorts of issues, there are so many different dots of information around, and it's how you join them together. One of the things he talked about was that Boris Johnson visited President Zelensky and talked him out of, even though an agreement had been signed, talked him out of it. Now, first of all, neither of us know what happened, but as a military guy who has access to quite a few people who were closer to Boris Johnson at the time, my understanding of it was that, yes, there had been an agreement. Whether it had been signed or not, there was certainly an agreement. But my understanding was that President Putin had effectively given President Zelensky Hobson's choice. He'd said, I'm either going to invade and I'm going to take what I want, or you can sign over to me. And you can sign over to me. This is what I want. Crimea, potentially part of the Donbass and whatever. And I will leave you be. But you've got to move on as well. If you don't, I'm going to invade. I'm going to take it because it's my right to do that. And all of the blood on the Ukrainians will be on your shoulders because you have the chance at the moment to walk away from this. Now, President Zelensky would have known that this giant of Russia was waiting there. He knew Ukraine was not a member of NATO. He couldn't have expected the West to come to his aid. And therefore, he's been read a very difficult riot act. And it is not a surprise, therefore, that he might have agreed to that. My understanding is then, in a conversation with Boris Johnson, but also a couple of other Western leaders, that sat down with him in a room, closed the doors and said, you do realise that I know you're not a member of NATO, but if Russia actually uses force to take land on the European mainland, that has profound implications for all of us. So actually, we will step in and help. I know you're not a member of NATO, but we will. In other words, gave Zelensky an ace to put in his hand. And I think that was enough for President Zelensky to also go, okay, if I did a deal and signed a bit of paper with President Putin, the last time Ukraine did that with a Budapest memo of 1994, we'll give up all our nuclear weapons in return for a cast iron guarantee of our sovereignty. Yeah, that deal lasted less than 20 years. So understandably, Zelensky was probably in a bit of a corner, but knew that he didn't actually have much wriggle room. Now the West gave him the opportunity to have some wriggle room. That seems to me far more plausible. The thing I'm less comfortable about, but I do think there's an explanation behind, is there's talks about Antony Blinken talking about writing down Russian forces. I have no doubt that since that decision was made, the West has been asked some difficult questions about why are you rushing to the aid of Ukraine when you aren't rushing to the aid of people in Sudan? You're not rushing to the aid of people in Africa. Why have you chosen Ukraine? And I think the answers have included things like, yeah, but it's on the European continent. We've got a bit of a memory of what happens with these things. They can spin out of control. And also, they have said that Russia...
Cameron said it.
No, exactly.
David Cameron.
And Russia was a driving threat when I was in the military for how much money we spend and what we spend it on. And therefore, I have no doubt that one of the benefits to the West of Russia playing its hand into Ukraine was that its military capability was written down. Is Russia the threat today to Europe that it was at the start of the war? No.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? So I firstly, it goes back to what you're saying about the way they used shells to bombard the enemy's trenches in the First World War. You have to make a decision at that moment when you're saying to Zelensky, no, hang on, we're going to turn this into a war for these reasons, and we want to look after you, but actually there's some side benefits as well. The calculus of that decision is that 8 million people are going to be displaced from Ukraine to foreign lands. Some of them may never get back. Several million are going to be displaced internally when their homes will be gone. And I don't know how many people, but a lot of people in Ukraine will die. So there is a balance, isn't there, to say, in doing what we're about to do, it's worth sacrificing the lives of real people. And what I think you said before was that's one of the sad decision consequences of war.
Do you know what's really interesting? And there's a bit of serendipity about this. You and I have not talked about this before, but I was with my brother a couple of nights ago. And one of the conversations that we were having was that, is it worth going to war when Putin simply wants to plant his flag in Ukraine soil? What would it mean for Ukrainians? Couldn't they just go about their business? Is it worth dying to protect their nation? And he was talking really about the Second World War, So if we had just said, come on in, Germany takes control, how bad could it be? They still need us to work. We still need to bring up our families. And it was an interesting philosophical debate. And the problem came where when you then said, right, so you do that, you don't fight for your values, you don't fight for your freedoms, you don't recognize the benefits of democracy. In a couple of years' time, in that example, it was Germany, but let's look at the example today. Russia just took over Ukraine. All of a sudden now, President Putin decides he wants to take Poland. So he turns around to all the families in Ukraine and says, right, your sons are now joining the military and you're going to fight in Poland for me. You don't have any choice in that anymore. And that's the impact, is you've got to at some stage work out, is our way of life, are our values, are our freedoms ultimately worth fighting for? And it's a really interesting philosophical debate because nobody wants to die for anything. But actually history is littered with people being prepared to pay that price so that we enjoy the freedoms we have today. And I think that's something that President Zelensky, as the leader, if he genuinely thought that he had no choice, then you've got to do what you believe is the right thing for your people. If you think you have a choice, and let's be clear, just because Putin says he's going to invade doesn't mean he's going to do it. It's like a bully at school. There's a threat of, it's quite another, was it 4 frogs on a log, one decides to get off. How many are left on the log? 4. Because making a decision to do something and actually doing it are completely different. So Putin may well have threatened, but you might have the judgment that goes, right, if the West is prepared to help, that might change Putin's calculus, and actually he might not come in at all. But you're absolutely right. This is grand strategy and a really difficult call. But going back to the point about Kennedy, pulling off sound bites around this, it may well be true, but my faith in the military, my faith in some of our systems and our freedoms means that my understanding is rather different than that. It's still the same sound bites, but there is a logic to them that says, Ukraine, you have a choice here, and we can help you with that choice.
Well, maybe we invite people to speak to us about it, give us some input and comments, because I'm sure comments will be divided in maybe more ways than two as well on this.
No, I agree.
So we seem to have got a different sort of war going on now between Hezbollah, Lebanon, and Israel. Apparently, the story is that Israel got some intelligence that there was going to be a strike deep into Israel from Hezbollah. They've got the military capability to do it. And Israel made a preemptive strike to take out the infrastructure, the launching capability, the supplies and so on. Despite that, Hezbollah managed to get off around 250 combination of missiles and drones. And obviously that part of the border between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, is sort of a war-torn area now. A lot of people have been displaced. There's a lot now going on, and it feels like it's going to get worse. So I think the big question before we get into the detail is, should all of us be worried that this will flare up into a much bigger conflagration? I
think the short answer is no. Why do I say that? Because in big handfuls, Israel had killed, was it Fuad Shukr, the one of the Hezbollah leadership, in a sort of an assassination attempt, and Hezbollah had said, we're going to take revenge. So we'd expected some sort of attack. Israel clearly had a plan, because if they know you're going to attack, they're going to cover all the options, plan for the worst, hope for the best. And the moment they got wind that something was happening, they pressed the button. Interesting timings. It was 4:30 in the morning on Sunday morning that Israel struck 100 jets.
Yeah, I heard. That's a lot.
40 targets. They claim that Hezbollah was planning to launch thousands of missiles. Now, Hezbollah apparently did fire them at 5 o'clock in the morning, 320 barrage of rockets and drones and the like against 11 targets. They even named them. What's interesting in the fallout, though, going back to your question, is that actually both sides have claimed success. Hezbollah can claim that they've avenged the death of their leader. They have struck a mortal blow against Israel, 11 military targets destroyed, and therefore that's it. And Hassan, the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, has made clear that that's it. Israel, by its staff, has turned around and said, we provided ultimate protection, nothing got through, we were dominant, Hezbollah didn't make it. So, and then both sides have subsequently said, we don't see this escalating, we don't want to see this escalating. So in a way, it feels like another one of these stage-managed efforts that Hezbollah had to be seen to be able to avenge the death of their leader. Israel had to demonstrate a stoical defense, but actually both sides are stepping back from the brink. The real question is Iran going to respond to the death of Ismail Haniyeh? And we've yet to see that happen yet.
I guess the question that sits behind all of that is something you were talking about before we came on the show, which is sitting behind everything is Iran. If that's the case, and Iran is sticking to its initial or its overwhelming objectives, then maybe this sort of thing, people will find reasons for this sort of thing to continue. In which case, this is it. This is it for this week. But next week there'll be something else.
As a military guy, when these sorts of things happen, I've been doing lots of interviews this week, and one of the questions is always, is this the beginning of World War III in the Middle East? And one of the things I try and do is sit back and not just look at the symptoms, but look at the disease. So there's lots, the media tends to focus on explosion or a bullet or a rocket or whatever, but they're just symptoms. behind all of this, what is actually the root thing that's going on? And what's going on is the war between Israel and Hamas. And there's currently negotiations ongoing about bringing that to an end. Can there be some form of ceasefire? Now, Iran is the dark shadow behind the three H's, Hamas, the Houthis and Hezbollah. And it's not a coincidence that the Houthis have been attacking shipping again, causing carnage in the Red Sea. Hezbollah have been incited to go and get fighting. But of course, the Lebanon does not want this to escalate into a full war. So they've been very prudent about what they're doing. And Hamas apparently is changing its tactics to now using suicide bombers. And Iran has turned around and said, if you don't come up with a solution and end this conflict, West, we're going to retaliate for the leader of Hamas. Last time they did that, I think it was the 13th of April this year, something like, I had them written down somewhere, 30 cruise missiles and 120 ballistic missiles. That's the sort of level of response that Iran could do. That is a lot worse than Hezbollah's flurry of relatively small, unguided rockets that, quite frankly, Israel's Iron Dome system should be able to take out.
Just before we went on air, I did a bit of research into what support Israel was getting, given the slight escalation in contact with Hezbollah. And sometimes this sort of stuff's not true, but the data was pretty specific. It's increasingly hard for Israel to support the war with Hamas. It's politically sort of dynamite. Hezbollah seems, you can position it to be a sort of different war. It's got nothing to do with Palestine or Gaza. But I heard that the US had sent 500 individual aircraft with military equipment, with 50 tons of equipment, totaling 107 shipments, armoured vehicles, bullets, shells, protective equipment for soldiers, medical supplies. That's quite a big thing. And apparently the reason was the increasing conflict with Hezbollah. Now, I've not had time to check it out. You're much better at doing that sort of thing than I am with your connections. But if that's true, that's quite a big development from the US to Israel to support this conflict.
No, I agree. And the other thing, obviously, it's not just about the equipment. The US has put two of its carrier strike groups into the region, Abraham Lincoln and the Theodore Roosevelt. They're bristling with air power, F-35s, F-18s and cruise missiles. I mean, most of those carrier groups have got more fighter jets than we've got nationally. And there's two of them in the region. They've also put the USS Georgia, I think it is, a submarine into the region. You sort of, why would you need a submarine? Well, those things have over 150 Tomahawk cruise missiles in them.
Really? Is that right?
Now, was there any evidence?
Where the hell does a submarine store? It's just a long tube.
Exactly.
It goes that way, not that way.
Not that way. No. How does it go?
Not that.
I got it. Yeah. I think the interesting question is, was America involved in the repelling of the Hezbollah attack? America says no. There's no evidence that they did. I think what's interesting there is that Israel is the dominant military power in the region, and therefore it should be perfectly capable of handling Hezbollah itself. When Iran decides to react, the last time it did that with that huge array of drones, missiles, cruise missiles, that's when an international response is required. And having the aircraft available, because you remember it was fighter jets shooting down most of the aircraft, plus some of the Patriot systems shooting them down. So I suspect that the Americans are keeping their powder dry for the day that if Iran decides to launch another one of those huge tirades, and that's when the West will be involved. Interesting one for me is the submarine, though, because if you simply want to do a protective shield around Israel, a cruise missile, the Tomahawk cruise missile doesn't do that. Tomahawk cruise missile is a GPS guided, it will take out a target on the ground. So what is that there for? And I think that's interesting, is that doing there in case of being able to do proactive military strikes against targets in Iran, I'm not quite sure, but that would probably put the submarine out in the Arabian Sea that's closer to Iran, whereas the carrier groups need to be able to launch their aircraft towards the incoming missile threat. So I'd probably position them in the Mediterranean Sea. But as you say, I think there's a split here. There's part of it's preparing for the onslaught from Iran, and the other bit about the kit you talked about, almost certainly that's to prepare Israel. They've had a very difficult campaign in Gaza. I've no way of knowing, but they will have used up a lot of weapons. They will have suffered some casualties. Some of the equipment will no longer be working. Making sure that you've still got a robust response to the Hezbollah action, I suspect that's what the Americans were providing.